individual practitioners. So along this line of thinking, past work has examined how practitioners do ethics in response to guidelines or technical interventions adopted by their organizations. Our work zooms out even more in scope by studying how software practitioners respond to self-identified ethical concerns without assuming any organizational buy-in in addressing those concerns. This allows us to reach a broader sample of respondents who work at organizations that may not explicitly prioritize ethics. We approach this topic with 3 research questions. 1, what are practitioners concerned about? 2, what happens when they develop ethical concerns? And 3, what affects their power to resolve their concerns? To answer these questions, we surveyed 115 tech practitioners with self-identified concerns. All participants filled out an open-ended survey asking if they've ever had ethical concerns about the software systems they were asked to contribute to, the actions they took, whether the concern was resolved, and factors which made acting harder or easier. 21 participants agreed to participate in a follow-up interview. Importantly, our sample is not representative of software practitioners as a whole. Our open-ended recruitment strategy makes use of self-selection in order to reach practitioners who are passionately invested in tech ethics. Our study asks, assuming a practitioner identifies a concern, how might they go about addressing it? The first thing we ask in our survey is for respondents to describe the system they were asked to contribute to and why they found it problematic. We ask these questions to identify what sorts of harms practitioners were concerned about. I'll tell you the one thing you need to know about these harms. Broadly speaking, they're the kind of harms that we as researchers are concerned about as well, but they don't map clearly onto a fair, accountable, transparent framework. For most of the least frequent, they were military, privacy, advertising, surveillance, environment, automation, inequality, and others. But we found that sorting concerns by their associated harms didn't actually give us a ton of signal about whether and how practitioners acted in any given scenario. So we developed an alternative way of sorting concerns according to scope, which is basically how much the organization's goals or priorities any given concern calls into question. We identified 4 overlapping categories to describe scope. Bugs, which are concerns arising from smaller unintentional behavior from a product. Features, which are intentional but non-essential aspects of a product. Product, which are concerns arising from the goals of a product itself. And organization, which are concerns pertaining to the practitioner's entire organization or industry. Focusing on the scope of a concern over the specific type of harm incurred helped us better understand how much agency practitioners felt. The more organizational incentives a concern calls into question, the more resistance a practitioner is likely to face. This leads into our second research question. What happens when software practitioners develop concerns about their work? Addressing concerns about bugs or features, some practitioners proposed technical solutions. For example, in response to being asked to add a location tracking feature to a workplace accountability app, one participant proposed geofencing the tracking within a certain perimeter. Although technical solutions fall closest to a practitioner's prescribed responsibilities, even these solutions are occasionally rejected due to resource constraints or other competing organizational interests. When butting heads against these interests, some practitioners sought to negotiate by appealing to organizational incentives. For example, one ML practitioner we talked to was concerned about his project's use of facial identification, one ML researcher concerned about his project's use of facial identification reported successfully pivoting the direction of his project by couching his ethical concerns within more practical concerns about achievability or resource constraints. When practitioners felt little agency in working within organizations, they sometimes refused to work on the project altogether. Refusal took various forms, including minimizing productivity, asking to be reassigned to another project, delivering ultimatums to management, or resigning from their post. On the flip side, practitioners also talked about feat voting, which is proactively seeking out employment at organizations that are more closely aligned with their values. This includes turning down lucrative job offers to work on projects they found morally unacceptable, vetting employers during the interview processes, or even physically moving to pursue new opportunities. Finally, some participants suggested leveraging legal systems. This included reporting illegal activities that their organizations were involved in, politically supporting legislation that would apply pressure to firms, or in the case of open source software, carefully choosing copyleft licenses that might potentially prevent its abuse. I want to stress that although I'm presenting these tactics rather matter-of-factly, these practitioners that we interviewed are human beings, not rational agents. As a result, almost all of them expressed that raising ethical concerns was stressful, with some reporting severe bouts of anxiety and depression. Moreover, failed escalations would sometimes lead to feelings of alienation or hopelessness. Besides the psychological toll of raising concerns, we found 3 external factors limited practitioners' agency. First is their financial and immigration situation. Tech workers with dependents, medical conditions, or little experience found it risky to take actions that could potentially compromise their employment. On the flip side, participants with significant savings, strong support networks, or good job prospects cited their security as a factor that made it easier to act. Similarly, practitioners who were on employment visas described needing to line up a new opportunity before taking any actions. The second key factor limiting agency was workplace culture. Many practitioners recounted that openness and shared values made raising concerns easier, while hierarchical and indifferent management could suffocate conversations around ethics. Some participants reported that maintaining a distant, professional relationship with management actually made raising concerns easier. Finally, organizational incentives affected how practitioners acted on ethical concerns. For example, employees at for-profit firms often felt they needed to frame ethics initiatives in terms of long-term financial incentives in order to gain support. On the flip side, practitioners at nonprofit firms and government organizations described how pursuing goods beyond profit made it easier to raise concerns. Still, one participant reflected on how nonprofits were beholden to donors with their own geopolitical agendas and so came with its own constraints. So here are 3 key takeaways from our paper. First, our research demonstrates that highly paid, relatively powerful tech practitioners still face significant barriers to acting on their ethical concerns. Having technical know-how and insider status, practitioners are well positioned to identify concerns with their work, but even in the best case scenario, they are mostly constrained to addressing these concerns through technical or design stage interventions. Any further change depends on their ability to legitimize their concerns to colleagues and management. The implications for education are also clear. Tech ethics courses for prospective tech workers should teach students how to communicate ethical issues as well as identify them. Secondly, the vast majority of reported concerns could not be addressed through technical or design stage interventions and instead related to systemic harms posed by the product's intended use case. Without the power to directly affect business decisions, practitioners saw few options other than withholding their labor, which often had a greater impact on the project than they could have ever imagined. Sometimes the absence of a single key developer could kill the project altogether. Future research could investigate just how much power individual practitioners wield over their projects, as well as how tech workers could amass more power in the workplace through coalition building. Finally, most of the practitioners we spoke to didn't work at big tech firms. Many were consultants or in-house engineers at non-technical firms, who reported concerns outside of well-studied harms like bias or accountability. In addition, we argued that the focus on AI in tech ethics discourse limits our scrutiny to implementation, foreclosing concerns about how that tech is used or monetized. Therefore, we suggest that AI ethics research may need to broaden to better account for the majority of software practitioners who do not work at major companies. Our work demonstrates concretely that building ethical software is about more than coming up with sophisticated interventions or more militant guidelines that don't account for larger scoped systemic harms. These will not matter as long as organizations do not adopt them or attempt to cheat them. We want more discussions in the ethical AI space to center around empowering the radicals among software practitioners that are deeply invested in mitigating harms. Thank you.
Okay, next up, we have Shreya Chowdhury speaking about can workers meaningfully consent to workplace well-being technologies?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for attending this talk. My name is Shreya Chowdhury. I'm an incoming PhD student at the University of Michigan, and on behalf of my co-authors, I'm excited to talk about whether workers can meaningfully consent to workplace well-being sensing technologies. Let's first define workplace well-being technologies. There are many different kinds of technologies being designed and deployed in the workplace to support workers' well-being. We specifically examine workplace well-being sensing technologies, which unobtrusively collect detailed data about individuals and group interactions to intuit well-being and hopefully help workers optimize their productivity and well-being. While there are hopeful applications of these technologies, they also raise a number of ethical concerns. including concerns of intrusions into workers' privacy, threats to workers' agency, and risks to dehumanization. These are especially important concerns given the history of technology-enabled workplace surveillance. In earlier decades, workplace surveillance was limited by time, costs, and resources. However, data-intensive technologies have reduced these obstacles and thus expanded the possibilities of workplace surveillance, making it virtually limitless. Prior research has documented workers' discomfort with being tracked in any form in the workplace. Critical data studies and STS scholars have argued that the kind of emotional surveillance enabled by these technologies can subject intimate areas of the worker's self to an invasive disciplinary gaze, which can then result in workers feeling violated, dehumanized, and controlled. A critical question regarding these technologies is whether workers can meaningfully consent. That is to say, when an employer asks for workers' consent, are they actually fully empowered to consent? Current standard consent practices, like informed consent, are ineffective. Prior research shows that these overly individualized practices do not meaningfully model consent. They are especially ill-suited to sensing technologies, which by design try to unobtrusively collect data without users' explicit awareness, making explicit consent difficult. Current consent practices also do not account for contextual factors like organizational power dynamics or workers' vulnerability in the workplace. Therefore, workplace well-being sensing technologies necessitate an approach to consent that can accommodate both the structural factors of the workplace and the complexities of the technology. Critical scholars have theorized about a more power-sensitive structural approach to consent, which recasts consent from a purely individual choice, which is a false illusion, to a socio-technical condition experienced at the individual level, more reflective of reality. This means deprioritizing the efforts to reform the procedural elements of consent and instead focusing on producing the legal, technical, and socio-organizational conditions for consent. Drawing on our understanding that power dynamics and context can make no impossible to say, feminist and sex-positive scholars have redefined sexual consent from no means no to yes means yes. They define meaningful consent as freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific, or FRIES. Our work adopts FRIES as a starting point for a grounded definition of meaningful consent that is sensitive to power dynamics, which are inherent to the workplace and naturally applicable to embodied interactions, as is the case for technologies that interact with and collect data on our bodies. Our study is guided by two research questions. First, what are the challenges to meaningful consent to workplace well-being sensing technologies in the workplace? And what socio-technical interventions can ameliorate these challenges and support meaningful consent? To answer these questions, we conducted 6 90-minute focus groups with 15 participants with diverse perspectives on consent and privacy, the workplace, and sensing technologies. We used focus groups to enable participants to draw on each other's expertise and experience, given that different participants may notice different challenges and refinements based on their roles. Each focus group consisted of 2 parts, an information gathering phase and an intervention refinement phase. In the information gathering phase, we sought to understand participants' perspectives on consent generally, with respect to FRIES, into a hypothetical workplace well-being sensing technology that we based off of existing technologies. In the intervention refinement phase, we showed participants sketches of socio-technical interventions that prior work found could support meaningful consent. These included one technical intervention, presented as a refinement to the consent agreement interface, an organizational intervention designed as a facilitated conversation to set boundaries around the use of technology before consenting, and a legal intervention, adapting HIPAA to employee health data. We solicited participants' suggestions of refinements to these interventions, how they may complement one another, and additional suggestions for other interventions. We thematically analyzed participants' perspectives on how the workplace, technology, or both can produce meaningless consent and synthesized 4 layers of challenges. An inherent power differential in the workplace, consequences of this power differential, inherent risks with the technology, and other technological barriers to consent. We also synthesized participants' suggestions for socio-technical interventions into 2 categories. First, the technology's aims and affordances, or changes to the design and mechanisms of the technology and how people interact with it. And secondly, policies and practices, or changes to the use of technology and regulation governing it. In the next slides, I will present some illustrative examples of challenges and interventions surfaced in our focus groups, and I encourage you to refer to the paper for a more detailed breakdown. So the first challenge to talk about is the fact that technology does not support ongoing consent. This challenge is an example of challenges that can be addressed by both interventions to aims and affordances and policies and practices. Participants named this challenge as a technological barrier to consent. Participants describe multiple interventions that might address this challenge, including encouraging deliberation in the consent process to preserve workers' autonomy by, for example, making the consent process more staggered and personalized, building interfaces that enable workers to better voice nuanced choices by, for example, increasing granularity by asking for consent to specific data streams rather than the whole technology, and facilitating active reflection on and adjustment of consent preferences by, for example, prompting workers to review their consent preferences in a timely, regular manner. Other challenges required more changes to policies and practices. Participants, especially US-based ones, named the fact that employers control their ability to meet their key needs, like their ability to make a living and their access to healthcare, as a facet of the inherent power differential within the workplace that significantly challenged meaningful consent. This challenge cannot possibly be solved purely through technological interventions, but rather may require a mixture of policies and practices, both within the workplace and outside of it. Interventions could include the employer showing a strong record of trustworthy behavior or being a benevolent employer, the employer supporting recourse and workers being able to interrogate data practices, and regulators enacting regulation to protect workers' rights and privacy, like their access to healthcare. But what are the implications of our findings? First, there are implications on adopting FRIES to workplace well-being sensing technology, as some dimensions, like enthusiasm, were deemed more complex to support, and other more implicit dimensions, like accountability and reciprocity, were amplified within the workplace. Secondly, participants emphasized the importance of establishing trust between employers and employees for meaningful consent, especially to address significant challenges like the one that I just mentioned. Though our study surfaced impossible interventions that could help, there wasn't consensus on whether this is even possible. Some participants pointed out that the inherent power asymmetry leads workers to naturally and necessarily distrust their employer and suggested stronger regulation to protect workers' rights. This connects to an open question about what role employers can and should play in supporting meaningful consent. Our participants also questioned the very use of these technologies within the workplace. They questioned the validity of these technologies, echoing recent calls to ban them, and rejected the very premise of the workplace knowing anything about their health, even if they were to consent. They proposed alternative means of supporting workplace well-being, such as being given a health stipend to use as they wished. These concerns raise the question, is consent to these systems a desirable end goal? Could consent to these systems act as a rubber stamp for unethical data collection? Taking inspiration from the Consentful Tech project, we were interested in how to make these technologies in their totality more consentful. In other words, we want to prioritize bodily autonomy and the dignity of workers in every aspect, from design to deployment. Our work, however, surfaced several structural barriers to making these technologies truly consentful. These include inherent risks within the technology. For example, workers may consent to these technologies under the false premise that they can actually accurately assess their well-being, and they also may not be able to revoke their consent while retaining access to these insights. Barriers like these raise concerns about whether it is even possible to build truly consentful workplace well-being sensing technologies. Our study highlights that companies should prioritize workers' interests, autonomy, and privacy in the design and deployment of workplace well-being sensing technologies. Thank you for listening, and thank you to my amazing collaborators and many people who gave us feedback throughout the study. You can find me afterwards for more questions or email or contact me on Twitter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Shreya. Next up, we have Wesley Deng presenting a paper on investigating practices and opportunities for cross-functional collaboration around AI fairness in industry practice.
Hi, everyone. My name is Wesley, a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University, and today I'm super excited to present our work on investigating practices and opportunities for cross-functional collaboration around AI fairness in industry practice. So effectively tackling social technical challenges like AI fairness requires substantial cross-functional collaboration among multiple roles. So cross-functional collaboration is a term used in industry setting to describe collaboration among diverse roles with various disciplinary backgrounds. So to effectively tackle social technical challenges like AI fairness, we need approaches from social sciences to to understand what fairness means for particular communications and social technical context. And we also need approaches from user study to user research and design to understand fairness in particular use cases and domains. We also need technical skills in AI, ML, and software development to address unfairness in AI system design and development. And of course, this is not the exhaustive list of skills we need here. However, prior work has surfaced that cross-functional collaboration is often absent or ineffective in industry AI fairness work. To start with, the metrics and methods used to conceptualize, evaluate, and address AI fairness issues can vary or might even be incommensurable across roles. In addition, existing tools and processes designed for tackling AI fairness issues are largely designed to be used by technical roles working in isolation and are not designed to support collaboration across roles. Finally, prior research has found that not all relevant roles in AI teams are incentivized or invited to collaborate around AI fairness. So these observations prompt us to ask the following research question in our study. First, how do industry AI practitioners overcome challenges around cross-functional collaboration in AI fairness? And second, what opportunities exist to improve cross-functional collaboration around AI fairness? To investigate, we conducted a two-stage studies. We first conducted a semi-structured interviews with 17 AI industry practitioners to understand the current practice around overcoming cross-functional collaboration challenges in AI fairness. We then conducted 5 design workshops with 12 AI industry practitioners to create a space for different roles from different companies to think about the preferred future of cross-functional collaboration for AI fairness. So if you are interested in our workshop activity, please refer to our full paper. Overall, our participants came from 17 technology companies with diverse roles, including technical roles like software engineer and data scientist, user-facing roles like UX designers, product-facing roles like product manager, and research roles like research scientist. We specifically recruit industry practitioners who have had experience working on fairness in AI by giving them a screening form. So in this talk, I'll highlight just a small sample of what we found here. First, we found that practitioners go beyond their current job descriptions to bridge the gaps in the understanding and evaluation around AI fairness to improve cross-functional collaboration. For example, there are crucial differences in AI practitioners' understanding of AI fairness in specific context and applications, which introduce challenges of effective collaboration and communication. To bridge this gap, UX1 held design workshops similar to those workshops designers often conduct with external clients and users with their internal team members to explore what a fair product recommendation system should look like. Very interestingly, to better engage technical roles in discussing their understanding around AI fairness, UX2 and Product Manager 2 mentioned hosting company-wide responsible AI hackathons because, well, hackathon is a format that's very familiar for technical roles like engineers and data scientists. Another gap in AI fairness is around the evaluation. For example, technical roles focus primarily on the model output, but user and product-facing roles tend to focus on biases and harms perceived by users. To bridge this gap, we heard from Product Manager 1 that they repurposed some of their regular team-level all-hands meetings as co-evaluation meetings. And Product Manager 1 also spent extra effort designing activities for these co-evaluation meetings to scaffold both technical roles and user-facing roles in understanding and aligning each other's perspectives on evaluating fairness issues. Next, we also found that participants adopted piggybacking as a compromise tactic for AI fairness collaboration under organizational constraints. So similar to prior work, we use piggybacking to refer to the process of identifying potential allies with similar or overlapping interests and utilize the piggyback on existing organizational resources and programs as much as possible. So we found that practitioners often piggyback on institutionalized procedures to carry out the AI fairness collaboration. For example, multiple practitioners across diverse roles and companies share that they piggyback on organization-wide mandatory privacy-related procedures such as privacy questionnaire or checklist in order to raise awareness about AI fairness and put AI fairness efforts into practice. As Data Science 3 shared here, after encountering a lot of pushback from their team members, they eventually carry out the AI fairness work by adding an extra set of questions specifically concerning AI fairness to the privacy impact assessment, something already exists so that they don't have to persuade people to do this. However, during the design workshop, we heard repeatedly from practitioners to desire implement standalone fairness assessment procedure, as well as further exploring the trade-offs and potential complementarity between privacy and fairness work instead of just smuggling fairness in with privacy assessment. We also found another format of piggybacking on quantification culture of AI development to carry out the collaboration. And in particular, participants shared that when collaborating with AI fairness with technical roles in AI fairness, they very strategically change their communication strategy to draw on quantitative approaches. However, many participants were aware of the potential pitfalls of using scores or percentages to reflect AI fairness and desire a better process to help navigate the current AI development culture around prioritizing quantification. Finally, participants shared their invisible labor and burden while working towards more effective cross-functional collaboration. For example, in one of the design workshops, data scientists and machine learning engineers shared that they often go beyond their current job description again to create educational documentation or accessible visualization to bridge the knowledge gap among AI practitioners. But these efforts are often overlooked by their leadership or team members. As Data Science 5 shared here, team members just don't understand the amount of work that goes into doing AI fairness work, because for any visualization or statistical analysis around AI fairness, it's not just, they put a lot of thought on this and think really broadly about the social technical nature of AI fairness. So given this observation around current practices, what are some opportunities and design implications? First, we suggest that future fact research should better support critical yet currently under-recognized bridging work in AI fairness cross-functional collaboration. For example, future research could design processes for practitioners across roles to exchange perspectives and deliberate around AI fairness issues, as we're already seeing a lot of practitioners are going beyond their current job descriptions to conduct this work already, right? And in addition, to help practitioners navigate the mismatches in goals and approaches for AI fairness evaluation across different disciplines, future fact and also HCI research could support integrating fairness-related insights from both quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis from user research. We also call for making the invisible labor in cross-functional AI collaboration visible and valuable. More specifically, future fact research could explore processes and tools that help team members and organizations better recognize and value the efforts that enable AI fairness collaboration and also AI fairness work in general. Organizations, on the other hand, need to recognize and incentivize the evolving roles of practitioners as translators, educators, and advocates as we surface in our current practice. This could include establishing new educational programs, training, and even specific job descriptions for AI practitioners committed to the development of more equitable and responsible AI. And indeed, this is something we already observe in some tech companies. So please refer to our full paper for an in-depth discussion around the opportunities and implications to support cross-functional collaboration in AI fairness. And thank you so much for being here, and super excited for the following talk and the following questions. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much, Wesley. Next up, we have Sonia Mei Wang speaking about the paper, We Try to Empower Them, Exploring Future Technologies to Support Migrant Job Seekers.
Hi, everyone. Today I want to present our paper, We Try to Empower Them, Exploring Future Technologies to Support Migrant Job Seekers. I'm Sonja, thank you for the introduction. My co-author Kristen is also here. And my other co-authors are Margherita, Milagros Micheli, and Bettina Behrendt. So first I would like to talk about profiling through algorithmic decision-making systems in public employment services. ADM systems have been introduced in many countries worldwide and are and are designed for various reasons, such as supporting job seekers, job counselors in their assessment of job seekers, and to support decision-making regarding the allocation of resources, such as funding for further education. So these systems have been criticized both in general terms and in relation to specific existing systems. An example for such criticism is that the biography of an individual is reduced to a numerical value or otherwise simplified structure. At FACT 2022, we presented the job seeker perspective on profiling in ADM systems, and more specifically, the perspective of migrants and refugees in Germany who are looking for jobs. And so this year, we present the perspective of third sector organization workers, so that is workers from nonprofit and non-governmental organizations. And we are interested in finding out, or we were interested in finding out how design visions for technology that is supposed to be used for job search and profiling changes when it is developed together with people who are interacting directly and informally with job seekers. And our research questions were, number one, what role do the TSO workers play in job search for migrants and refugees? Number two, which factors do TSO workers deem important for job search, and how do these factors compare to factors ADM systems use for calculation? And number three, what do TSO workers see as an ideal technological approach to helping job seekers with their job search? Before I come to our method, I want to briefly give an overview about the access to the German job market for migrants and refugees. So in Germany, state-recognized qualifications and academic titles are often seen as more important than practical skills. This means that migrants and refugees in Germany are impacted by problems with the recognition of their degrees, as well as missing diplomas and missing work certificates. And on top of that, there are laws that forbid refugees from working until a certain time period has passed. And this is where the TSOs come into play. So previous studies found that internships are an important way to enter the German job market, and that refugees often find their first job through internships. Or through other informal means, such as getting recommended by acquaintances, but also through TSOs and other people who are in the TSOs network. So the TSOs are important to help build social capital, as they have connections not only to other organizations, but also to companies, and they can help with administrative matters, such as contact with the public employment services. So we used two methods to explore our research questions. The first one was expert interviews. We conducted 13 semi-structured interviews with TSO workers that took place from June 2022 to September 2022. And these interviews were with workers from TSOs which were geared towards migrants, meaning that these organizations mainly supported migrants from certain regions, which could be regions like Latin America or others, or women, but they were all geared towards migrants. And we used 3 interview guides depending on the services offered by the organization. Our second method was design fictions, and we received 11 design fictions. And the participants were given material with written instructions, as we can see here on the picture on the right. And we asked the participants to assume that they are in the year 2050 and that the world and technology have drastically changed. And in this scenario, we asked them to imagine that they have an object that they can use to support job seekers in their job search, or that they can give to the job seekers to enable them to, so that the job seekers can use it for their job search. And we asked the participants to textually and or graphically describe this object. And we also suggested some questions to facilitate the imagination process, such as how does this object interact with you and the job seekers. So at the top, we can see the instructions with the suggested questions, and at the bottom, we can see one of the design proposals. Okay, so some findings that were interesting are that from the interviews, we found that TSO workers take into account some of the factors that ADM systems also use. Examples would be the age of a job seeker, the education level, job experience, and the knowledge of the German language. But they go beyond such formal criteria, and they especially focus on so-called soft skills like communication skills, openness towards other people, and also in general the motivation to find a job and the willingness to learn about new things. And in our design fictions, we received proposals with different types of technologies. So those were several types of robots. We can see this here on the right, where someone sketched their ideas, and that is one of the robots. Also a helmet with sensors, a server which would use a cotton swab to extract skills, and several types of apps, a self-writing and thought-reading pen, VR glasses, smart glasses, and a dictionary for simultaneous interpretation, which was inspired by Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But I will go more into detail in the following slides. So one of the themes which was prevalent in both the interviews and the design fictions was the wish to empower job seekers through information. So in the interviews, it was mentioned several times that job seekers get offered information related to the entire process of job search. So with helping with resumes, helping with writing application letters, but also information about labor laws. So what are my obligations towards my employer, and what is their obligation towards me? Because there were some, there were also some issues described by our participants. And in the design fictions, this was reflected through technologies that support job seekers in practical tasks related to the job search. For example, the VR glasses were envisioned to also have the ability to help the job seeker write a resume, and also to give information on what kind of education would be needed to pursue a certain job, and also what the expected wage would be for a certain job. And through the VR environment, the job seeker would be able to kind of look over the shoulder of a person who is currently working in this job. And another important theme in both the interviews and design fictions was the exploration of personal interests and strengths. Interestingly, currently this is conducted mostly through paper and interview-based methods during counseling conversations. In the design fictions, this was also picked up, but most of these design fiction proposals do not include human-to-human interaction, and instead they are envisioned to automatically extract strengths and interests of job seekers. We go into more detail and discuss this more in the paper. Based on the specific visions described by our participants, we want to propose a specific technology that could be a focus for future work. So in our interviews, it was mentioned several times that existing tests on personality and aptitude are very disjointed from each other and are of very limited use to the counselors. So we propose that existing resources on personality and aptitude tests should be put into a richer ontology database that maps existing professions to relevant competencies and interests, and that other tools like a resume builder and job explorer should be offered alongside that, and we are currently working on a resume builder. So I'm coming to our takeaway messages. So one of the important messages is that TSO workers do consider to some extent the same factors that ADM systems use, but they put a focus on so-called soft skills like the willingness to learn and motivation, or to summarize, they go further than these criteria and really focus on the person themselves. And the envisioned technologies would enable job seekers to do more tasks on their own to empower them. and I brought a quote which expresses this. So one of the participants said, "Not that we overburden him, but that we offer him help where he needs it, and there, what is so beautifully understood by this funny term empowerment, demand from him what he can also do himself." Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us.
Okay, and for our final talk for the session, we have Sana Ali speaking about walking the walk of AI ethics, an ethnographic study of ethics workers in technology companies.
One second, sorry. Cool. Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Sana Ali, and I'm here presenting our paper. My co-author Andrew Smart is here as well, and this is also a collaboration with Angel Kirsan and Rita Katila. So here at FACT, there's been a lot of work around new tools and processes that practitioners can use in their development of new algorithmic systems. But journalists, oh, this is not, oops. Sorry. Journalists and academics have claimed that companies are merely ethics watching and co-opting ethics. So we wanted to know what was happening on the ground when ethics tools and processes are brought to organizations to be implemented. So there's been some work on the critique of actual principles before they're implemented, more along the lines of that they're vague and limited. There's also been some work around obstacles to implementation, but these studies don't account for the organizational dynamics that lead to these obstacles. And there's also been some work on the abstract logics that are in conflict with ethics work. So Metcalf, Moss, and Boyd argue that these institutional logics create potential for pitfalls introduced to prevent the work of ethics owners from addressing the broader goal of a more just, algorithmic, and data-driven world. So they identify ideological contradictions inherent in AI ethics work, and we build on this work to map out the concrete roadblocks that instantiate and complement these abstract logics. So our research questions are, how are ethics initiatives and interventions implemented in AI product development cycles in practice? And what are the organizational barriers to implementation? So in order to understand these questions, we turn to organizational theory. So according to neo-institutionalism, there are two sources of institutional change. The first are exogenous jolts or environmental pressures. So for example, the techlash, which brought a lot of these issues to the forefront. And then the second is endogenous action from actors embedded within the organization. So typically, we find that exogenous pressures are often not enough to produce true institutional change due to decoupling, which I'll explain in a minute. So instead, those jolts precipitate the emergence of actors who facilitate the diffusion and adoption of new practices. So in an ideal case, you have formal policies which are then implemented into daily practices, and they then produce the intended outcome. However, one form of decoupling, the policies are not actually implemented in practice, and so they may or may not produce the intended outcome. And then a second type of decoupling called means-ends decoupling, which is more prevalent in contemporary organizations. Formal policies are indeed implemented into daily practices, but they are not necessarily tied to outcomes. So an example would be mandatory diversity training in a large company that is not always effective, but they can be largely ceremonial. So they are implemented, but they're not necessarily effective. And so Bromley and Powell, who came up with this differentiation, suggests that means-ends decoupling is more prevalent in contexts where outcomes are hard to measure and when the rationalized environment is fragmented. And I'll explain this in a second, but drawing on this characterization, the case of AI ethics appears to be a good candidate for means-ends decoupling. So given that it's a good candidate for decoupling, we need a better understanding of the individual and interpersonal dynamics upon which institutional change in the technology industry therefore depends. So to understand that, we turn to institutional entrepreneurship. So institutional entrepreneurs have to break with the institutional rules, practices, and logics, and institutionalize the alternative that they are championing. So our sample consisted of individuals who worked, employees, academics, and consultants who primarily ethics workers who currently or formerly were employed as part of responsible AI initiatives at technology companies. And our sample was highly educated, 96% held graduate degrees, and they held diverse backgrounds in terms of social science, technical backgrounds, and that was reflected in their job titles, researcher, engineer, program manager, just some of the examples. And it was also fairly diverse, both in terms of gender and race. We spoke to many people who were non-binary, female, some ethnicities are listed here as well. And many people we contacted declined to participate due to non-disclosure agreements and advisement from the legal team at their company about intellectual property, other concerns around privacy and undisclosed reasons. So we also just want to emphasize the importance of openness from companies to be able to understand what's going on from the academic community. So what did we find? Well, surprisingly, participants were pleasantly surprised by how agreeable product teams were. So, sorry, I'm doing two at once. Kate, a PhD student who had worked at multiple companies in AI ethics-related roles, said, "Everyone's like, oh, I want to do this. I'm happy to help you. I'm happy to participate." And many other participants mentioned similar reactions. Despite these positive reactions, ethics workers still faced challenges when it came to the implementation of recommendations or practices. So why is that the case? Well, there was enough buy-in that these workers were hired into these roles, but there wasn't enough leadership buy-in to actually give them the authority to mandate changes and resources, such as time and personnel for data labeling, or other formal requirements like reviews or audits early in the development cycle. As a result, the responsibility to affect change was very individualized, and thus in turn led to ethics issues being inconsistently addressed. And this is also part of just the broader environment within tech, which is very flattened and non-hierarchical, and people are just generally, authority is located there's a lack of authority, and it's more through influence and charisma and persuasion. So in this individualized environment, what were the barriers faced when ethics workers tried to implement ethics without the proper authority and resources? The first one we'll talk about is product innovation as the highest priority. So I mentioned this earlier, that means-ends coupling can emerge when there's a fragmented, rationalized environment. In the case of AI ethics, the technology industry assumes product innovation as the core task of the organization, while environmental pressures emphasize values like fairness and justice. So here I'll present the ways in which the goals of frequent product innovation supersede goals related to responsible AI, if it's not siloed entirely. So some of the challenges are that the power is located with product managers who are responsible for the timeline, the resources, and the product decisions. And then ethics entrepreneurs, in turn, will encounter resistance if their recommendations are likely to delay timelines for product launches. So Sam, who previously worked at a big tech company but transitioned to a nonprofit, said, they might be like, we don't have time for this, we have to get to launch. No one was antagonistic to it, but there was just this pressure to get this thing out. So how did they then, in turn, deal with this, these challenges? Okay, 2 minutes. So there's one example is they would network to find allies and influential team members. They would encourage early engagement in the product development cycle, and they would reframe issues in terms of mutual interests, such as product quality. So Kate, who was a PhD student, said, I very rarely say fairness or ethics or anything like that because that's a loaded word. I really try to go to product teams with the idea that I'm here to help you make a better product. In my experience, in the way that organizations work, everyone can get behind making better products. So in turn, there was a wide variation in interactions. Interpersonal dynamics could take precedent in how a matter unfolded. So Parker, a former engineer and ethics worker at a big technology company, said that as often as a team would totally blow you off, there'd be some team somewhere doing something relevant that had one person who's interested in talking to you or working with you. So it depends so much. And so this resulted in inconsistency in how and whether specific issues were addressed. Next, company goals were operationalized through metrics. So that emphasis on product was very metrics oriented. So North Star metrics like daily active users, customer lifetime value, and then product teams were so focused on these metrics that they were afraid any intervention to improve fairness, for example, would degrade their models, make them less accurate, or affect their ability to meet targets. And so ethics entrepreneurs had to do a lot of labor to preemptively assuage these fears. Not only that, but they also were pressured to determine, measure, and provide quantitative evidence for their own ethics-related goals, which is pretty difficult to do as well, ethics being quantifiable. North Star metrics around engagement were so highly prioritized that any recommendations to reduce those metrics required irrefutable quantitative evidence. So Dave says, no matter, I'm really over time. No matter how much people want to do a good job, at the end of the day, quarterly goals will get in the way, whether it's revenue or monthly users that your job depends on. Early advice I got was if you could ever get the CEO to say one of our North Star metrics is related to ethics or fairness, that would have changed everything. And finally, frequent reorganizations of workers. A lot of our participants talked about the organization frequently reorging. So workers being put on different teams and teams being eliminated, and this is all in service, supposedly, of product innovation, but it really impacted James, for example, who was a PhD intern at a big tech company who ended up having 3 different bosses over the course of his 3-month internship. So this organizational practice meant that James's team was unable to access institutional knowledge that might help him do his job better, and it also meant that the relationships that ethics entrepreneurs had taken time to build and depended on for their work were disrupted, creating additional friction and inefficiency to implement ethics. So I'm really running out of time. I'm out of time, so I will just briefly say that this was very risky for individuals, and particularly marginalized individuals. And I will direct people to our paper for more because I'm so out of time. And we also have a full talk on YouTube if you want to catch that. And thank you. I'm really speeding through the end. There was so much to cover, so thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sana. Actually, you can stay up there. We have time for questions, so I could ask all the other speakers to come up. And yeah, apologies for the timing. I just want to make sure that we do have time for Q&A. So we have about 6-7 minutes, so please invite folks to come on up to the microphones and pose questions, as well as we can field some questions from the virtual platform. So yeah, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks very much. My question is with regard to the first, third, and last papers, particularly about how like individuals are dealing with the how individuals are dealing with the workplace challenges intrinsic to doing this kind of work in environments with many other priorities. As this tension that these tensions you've identified are sort of characteristic of these things, I'm wondering if there's a degree to which like people also consider this tension to be with their job role or identity as engineers or developers, or if that's something they draw strength from, if that makes sense.
At least in our, that's a great question. So what I heard from that was not only is this in tension with perhaps their job, but their sort of roles or identities as engineers. Yeah. In our case, there's a lot of work that does show that. In other studies I've done, I've seen that happen, sort of what is their role. In our work, I think it wasn't so much a conflict with our identity because they'd already identified these concerns. They already self-identified concerns, and therefore they had sort of worked through like that they wanted to think beyond what they sort of thought as their narrowly scoped identity as an engineer, I guess. But I think that's a really good framing because oftentimes an identity as an engineer does sort of scope one to more narrow concerns. I'd be happy to talk more.
All right, this is a question from Hopin from Anonymous. It's pretty brief. It's a question for Wesley Deng. What are some implications of your work in connection with Payel's keynote yesterday? The keynote being on feminist data, feminist principles for workers.
Yeah, I think the work is super relevant to that part, and I think, as we mentioned, a lot of time workers, when they are working on ethical work, they are in a very how do I frame this? They are always advocating. They are the genuine industry practitioners who really want to do ethical and build responsible AI, but they always got under-resourced. They are fighting every day. They are exhausted, right? So I think, as I mentioned at the very end of the paper, fact researchers, we could think about building tools and processes to support them to do this type of translation work that has been under-recognized by organization. And for organization, we advocate for reimagine the roles and highlighting some this invisible labor practitioners have been taken upon, and really supporting them as individuals when they're doing this type of advocating work. Great question.
Hi, I'm Jess from the University of Colorado Boulder, and I think this question, it could be for any of you, but maybe it's most relevant for Wesley and Sana. So I'm wondering, I guess in some of my previous work, I've noticed that the motivation to do ethical work and to do things like responsible AI hackathons, that's not really lacking from practitioners, but what is lacking is the time and incentives to do this work, and like really the prioritization, kind of, as you were saying, Sana, through like business metrics like KPIs and stuff to motivate doing this work. So I'm kind of wondering what any of you think is maybe one of the most promising first steps to try to incentivize the higher ups, like the business executives, to begin creating a pipeline where this work is prioritized and these people who are already motivated have the time to do this work?
Yeah, great question. I think one thing that participants mentioned was regulation is a way of like reordering incentives. So if there's a fine associated with doing unethical activities, then they will take this more seriously. And I think that even within the organization, the emphasis on quantitative metrics is kind of problematic. So like Wesley was saying, like more qualitatively recognizing ethics work. So like, okay, someone did this and we need to like reward that and recognize it rather than only recognizing when people are hitting their KPIs. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
I'll just quickly add on something. I feel like a lot of time when we're talking about responsible AI, we tend to not talk enough about the capitalism and the profit-driven nature. And I think relevant to my paper, when we are talking about cross-functional collaboration in responsible AI, business team and marketing team, they should actually be more connected to this pipeline. So we can incorporate, thinking about, first we have a pipeline for the project, and then we need to think about how might we effectively make responsible AI more agile, so that we can have leadership will see we don't have to perhaps spend a very long time to grab some low-hanging fruit. I think that's a very initial first step. And I think this is also a compromise tactic. But again, I hope this addressed a little bit of your question. Yeah.
Great, we have time for one more question in the session.
Hi, Michal Luria from the Center for Democracy and Technology. My question is for Sonia. So I was curious about your use of design fiction, and I was wondering if you could speak a little more about how you translated these kind of far-out scenarios where people envisioned all kinds of things into more practical next steps and findings.
Yeah, so the design fictions were, I mean, if you're familiar with the method, they're really like science fiction-like. So yeah, they were mostly not feasible, but we really try to distill what they have in common, and that is what I very briefly showed in my presentation. So this notion of empowerment, but also the role of the organization itself. So that is also discussed in our paper, because I mentioned it very briefly, the human-to-human interaction was actually quite minimized, and that is something which is also interesting to explore further. We did not completely follow up on that, we just discussed it. And so I think what I really tried to synthesize was what was said in the interviews, like how do they currently help the job seekers, and then how they envisioned the technology to help, and how would this be, like, how can we do it with feasible technology, or technology that is currently available. And we are like following up on that, so that's why I mentioned at the end, we are building a resume builder right now, and I hope we can soon also hold a presentation about that one. So basically just take the aspects of, okay, how would we help, and how is this feasible with the technology, and also our own skills, and hopefully inspire other researchers that have skills in other technologies like VR glasses to maybe follow up on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I encourage you all to keep the conversations going after this, and let's go ahead and thank all of our amazing speakers.